All right, good afternoon. Welcome. Good to see everybody. It's great to be here today. I confess that as I walked around the campus this morning, I kept thinking, Trump with a tweet. Oh, excellent. When I walked around campus this morning, I kept thinking, I want to be a CMC alum. This looks fantastic. It would be great to have gin and tonics in the morning. That looked awesome. And I should also thank you for coming to this talk today. I'm not sure that I would have left an outside bar behind on a beautiful day to come in and hear about the state of our national politics, right?
The bar's going to be open tonight, too.
What's that? Oh, yes, tonight. Yes. Speaking of which, there's also a policy mixer sort of after the talk at 4 o'clock. So if you want to keep talking politics, American politics, I'd invite you, if you can bear it, I invite you all to the reception. I think they're serving Prosecco and caviar, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it'll pretty good. So I'm here today to talk about my current book project, which the origins of which really began on election night in 2016. And there are a lot of course, books born on that night. Mine is just one of them. And like many of you, I was glued to my laptop, sort of watching the returns come in. I have to say, you know, it was really one of the most astonishing elections of my lifetime, right? I'm not sure what comes close. I was trying to think of, right, what was the second most surprising election in my lifetime? Maybe the election of Jesse the Body Ventura as governor in Minnesota. Didn't see that coming. You know, that sense of shock and surprise really didn't weaken in the days that followed the election. In many ways, in fact, as I learned more about the results, I became more surprised by the outcome. And that's largely because there were many counties, in fact, over 200 counties, that voted for Barack Obama and then flipped and voted for Donald Trump. Now, some of these places are bellwethers. You know, they kind of swing back and forth as political winds shift, and so it's not so surprising that they swung from Obama in 12 to Trump in 16. But many of them were not. They had been very loyal Democratic counties that consistently vote for Democratic candidates. Some had not broken for a Republican since 1984, right, when Reagan beat Walter Mondale in a landslide. Another large group of counties had not voted for a Republican since 1972, right, when Nixon beat George McGovern. Some had even been faithful to the Democratic Party for an even longer period of time, right? In fact, one county in Kentucky, Elliott County, had never voted for a Republican. Not since the county was formed in the 19th century. It had been the most loyal Democratic community in the whole nation, and it voted for Donald Trump. And of course, you know, we're accustomed to talking about the Nixon Democrats in 1972 and the Reagan Democrats in 1984, but the Trump Democrats in 2016 are far more interesting, right, than the Nixon Democrats or the Reagan Democrats, because after all, in 1972 and 1984, those were landslide Republican victories. So, you know, it's not really that surprising that in those partisan tidal waves, that you get a lot of Democratic communities and counties flipping to the other side. But 2016 was not that kind of an election, right? In fact, the Democratic candidate won the popular vote, yet nonetheless, right? Nonetheless, Trump won a lot of these long-standing Democratic counties. So what happened, right? Why did so many places that were reliably Democratic, that you could just sort of pencil in, right? That place is going to go Democratic. Why did those places that I might remind you voted for Barack Obama twice, support Donald Trump? um, why do, and I guess more generally, right, why do some Democratic communities, why do some Democratic communities have such a different assessment of Trump, right? Because the Democratic community I live in, I suspect the Democratic communities that some of you live in, have a very negative view of the president, right? And we're used, of course, to thinking about the blue-red divide, but we don't often think about the divide that opened up within blue America, right? Why did these Democratic communities have such a different assessment of our president? And so to answer these questions, my co-author and I spent time doing field work in 3 of these communities in different parts of the country. So we spent time in Ottumwa, Iowa, in Elliott County, Kentucky, and in Johnston, Rhode Island. And each town is distinctive in certain ways. You know, Ottumwa, it's an industrial Rust Belt town, so it's got a large meat packing plant, it's got a John Deere factory, it's been hit hard by deindustrialization. Elliott County, Kentucky is very rural and small. I mean, there's one sort of little motel in the whole county. Johnston, Rhode Island is really different. It's a suburb of Providence with a large Italian-American population, but they have certain things in common. They're all overwhelmingly working-class places. Mostly the citizens there have high school degrees, and they've all been deeply democratic kinds of places. So all the local politicians are Democrats and have been for a long time. And indeed, all these places had not voted for a Republican president since before I was born. Okay. And when we studied these places, we were interested not just in what local citizens said about Trump, we were also interested in what they did. That is, we were interested in the local culture, right? What did the behaviors of the folks in this town, what did those behaviors reflect about the social and political norms in these communities? In other words, we were really interested in understanding these places as culturally distinct, right? In what ways are they culturally different from, say, the Democratic towns that, again, I live in and I suspect many of you live in? So today I'm going to talk about some of these findings, and before I do, I should also note that we've been also greatly helped by students. We had a group of students come with us to Ottumwa, Iowa last summer to help with the field work. I've got another larger group of students coming this semester, and it's been great for me, but it's also been just a great educational experience for them to get out of their class bubble and really get immersed and spend time in working class communities. I mean, I've been describing it as a kind of domestic study abroad, right? Because it's you know, in some ways it's arguably more of a countercultural experience to go to a Rust Belt town in Iowa than to go to Paris or London or, right, some of these other places that our students go and study in. Okay, so what did we find? You know, I'd like to begin, I'm going to talk about a couple of findings today, and I'd like to begin by talking about the most famous Trump Democrat, someone that you might know, whose name is Kanye West. And, you know, maybe you know Kanye West, maybe you don't. He's a hip-hop artist. He's also married to Kim Kardashian. And Kanye West, he made waves a couple of years ago when he tweeted, and I quote, he said, he declared his real kinship with Donald Trump. He said, "We are both dragon energy. He is my brother." Of course, that sent poor Kim Kardashian into a panic, right, as she had to do various kinds of damage control. And a really baffled media struggled to make sense of Kanye, right? Like, what's gotten into him? Why would this black hip-hop artist consider Trump a brother? Right? Why would he feel that kind of kinship with Donald Trump? And I have to say, when he said it, when Kanye West said, look, Trump's got dragon energy and I like him, that didn't surprise me at all. Or I should say it seemed very familiar, because a lot of the folks that we talk to like Trump's dragon energy too. And that's because these working class communities and Kanye West have been deeply shaped by an honor culture. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about honor culture, then give you a sort of flavor for what this looks like on the ground. Now, if you're not familiar with honor cultures, it's not because they're uncommon, right? Honor cultures are found practically everywhere. That is, they're found practically everywhere outside of educated professional communities, or college towns. The American South has long been associated with them, but they're also found throughout the United States, including in black urban ghettos. They're found in poor white rural communities. And honor cultures provide really clear rules for determining social status and for managing conflicts. So if you're in an honor culture, it's important that you not tolerate any insult, right? You must show your readiness to defend your honor and your reputation for toughness. It's critical that you never show any weakness. And as we'll see, Trump has dragon energy in the eyes of lots of our subjects because he defends his reputation for toughness. Right? He does so by, right, nothing rolls off the president's back, right? Whatever you think of him, he doesn't let an insult slide, right? He always punches back. And he does so, I would say, partly because he participates in this culture of honor. Right? So, unlike the Democratic communities in places like Claremont and college towns, the Democratic towns that we studied approve of individuals, and especially men, who are aggressive and who are really attuned to really small slights. Okay? And I think this, aside from nationalism, his nationalism, I think probably Trump's respect for this culture is what distinguishes him most from most other modern presidents. Trump's philosophy of leadership is to never show weakness, especially when he's challenged by his enemies. In Bob Woodward's account, he's got this great book on Trump, and he quotes one of Trump's friends who said that Trump once told him, and I'm quoting him here, he said, Trump once said, "Real power is fear. It's all about strength. Never show weakness. Don't be bullied. There is no choice." I think Trump has mostly taken this advice. This tells you a lot about his philosophy of leadership. Now, critics have characterized this style, they've characterized his relentless counterpunching as evidence of his narcissism, of his thin skin. But I think if you just make that criticism, I think if you see Trump as a sort of, if you see his behavior as sort of symptoms of a disordered mind, which, we could talk about that. I think it misses the ways in which the president's behavior is totally normal inside of lots of other kinds of communities, right? So the folks in the working class communities we investigated praised Trump for his toughness, for his refusal to back down, for his refusal to apologize. Okay? Indeed, to a large degree, the social and political life of these communities is ordered by this culture of honor. So whereas his thin skin is evidence of some psychological pathology in places like Claremont, that same sensitivity is really familiar in everyday life in the sorts of towns and communities that we studied and visited. And I want to give you a flavor for this. I want to talk about a few of our subjects so you get a sort of sense of what this looks like. We sat down with a guy named Jimmy who works in a meat packing plant in Ottumwa, Iowa. And Jimmy, I like Jimmy a lot. He works hard. He used to work on the line cutting hogs in the plant, and then his body started to break down, and so now he does custodial work in the plant. And he's a lifelong Democrat. And he's never been more excited by a presidential candidate than Donald Trump, ever. And when we asked him what he liked about Trump, this is what he said. I'm going to quote Jimmy for you. He said, his strength. He was a really strong person. I could see that. And he's not going to be bullied by anybody. This country has just been weak. And when he spoke to you, it brought strength back. And people feel threatened by that power. I've never seen a guy with so much energy. If he said dragon energy, it would have been too much, right? No one would believe me, right? They think I'm just fabricating the data, right? Who would trust me, right? But kind of close to Kanye West, right? There's a similar kind of view. Or consider the case of Vicky. Vicky spent her life working as a trucker, and then later in a corn processing plant in Iowa. And Vicky recalled that watching Trump for the first time, and this is what she said. She said at the time she thought, he's got some braggadocio, and he's got some self-confidence we haven't seen in ages. She then compared him favorably to Muhammad Ali. She said, Ali, he was a braggadocio too. He was a performer, and people love that. Now, thousands of miles from Ottumwa, in a suburb just outside of Providence, is a town named Johnston, and I sat down at the local coffee clutch, which is where all the working class guys like to hang out on the weekends and sort of chew the political fat. And I talked to a guy named Terry, and Terry's a colorful guy. He rolls up each morning in his sort of beat up Cadillac. He's a big tattooed guy who looks like Kenny Rogers. And in fact, that's what the locals call him, right? He looks like a tattooed Kenny Rogers. He looks like Kenny Rogers before the plastic surgery. So the locals say he looks more like Kenny Rogers than Kenny Rogers, right? He's also a big fan of Trump. And so when, Terry, I was talking to Terry and he said, do you know why I like Trump? I said, why? Tell me. And he said, because he's got balls. Again and again, Trump enthusiasts said they like Trump because he doesn't back down, because he has balls, because he doesn't take crap, because he means business, because he tells it like it is, because he's got a fighting spirit. He doesn't apologize. So, but we were also interested not just in what citizens said about Trump. We were also, again, interested in what they did and what those behaviors suggest about the social and political norms in these communities. Right? So notably, for example, these communities have a long history of electing politicians that are Trumpian, right? That resemble Trump in lots of ways. I'll mention Johnston's popular mayor, for example, who's Joe Policina. He's been in office for over 10 years. He's very popular. He's always reelected by a large margin of the vote. And this is how Mayor Policina described his politics. He says, I'm kind of like a street fighter when it comes to politics, because that's the only thing people understand. He said, you can't be nice to people when they're taking shots at you. And I said, well, why not? Right? Why can't you take the high road? Right? Why can't you just let things roll off your back? Why can't you be more gracious? Right? As Michelle Obama said, right? Why can't, right, when people go low, we'll go high, right? Why not invoke that kind of ethic, right? And he said, no, of course not. It shows your weakness. And then people will just roll right over you. And his fighting spirit is on display at every town meeting. At every meeting, there's a handful of local citizens who show up that don't like him very much and give him a hard time. And Policina is not, he lets them have it, right? He calls them misfits, malcontents, douchebags, sound Trumpian, right? This confrontational honor culture has incidentally deep roots in nearby Providence. I don't know if anyone here is from New England or sort of knows Providence politics. It's got a colorful history in politics. It used to be dominated by the Irish and then later the Italians. And it's, mafia. Its mayors historically have been men who are hot-tempered, who are crude, who are combative. And most recently, the most famous and beloved and really infamous politician there is Buddy Cianci, who was a real colorful guy. And he used to hang a poster in his office that read, "It's better to be the stomper than the stompee." I guess if those are your choices, right? That makes sense. And practically any slight could send the mayor charging. I'll give you an example. Once he tried to get into a late-night club, and the bouncer wouldn't let him in. And you don't do that to Mayor Cianci, right? And the bouncer didn't because the place was crowded, and the bouncer therefore said, "No, Mayor, you've got to wait." And this made Cianci furious. So the next day, he sent the health inspector down there to suspend the license of the club. And so the club owner went to go see Cianci and complain about this treatment. And Cianci sort of stopped him and said, "Look, don't get into a pissing match with me, because you're a cup of water and I'm Niagara Falls." That was his style. Okay. Now, I know what you might be thinking, right? These are just these Italian Americans, right? Like in Providence. No. Back in Ottumwa, back in Iowa, a very place that's in many ways culturally different from, right, Italian Providence, the local politicians are quite similar in many ways. The former mayor and current county supervisor is a guy by the name of Jerry Parker, and he was very much like Policina in lots of ways. I'll give you an example. At a recent Democratic committee meeting, he got into a tussle with another Democrat there, and Jerry Parker was a big supporter of Hillary Clinton in 2016. There was a guy named Alex who's a strong supporter of Sanders, and quickly that conflict escalated, as conflicts tend to do in Ottumwa, Iowa. And so Jerry got into Alex's personal space. Right? This is how Alex remembered it. He says, "I think that if we were frat boy types, it would have been a chest bump. But since we're both fatties, it was more of a belly bump." And then Jerry Parker said, "Let's take this outside." Keep in mind, this is an elected Democratic politician, right? That's right. So now in Ottumwa, if you don't fight back, you suffer the consequences. Even if you don't like this culture of honor, even if you think it's retrograde and wrong, in some ways you have to respect it to get by. And I'll give you an example of this. You even see this in working class sort of factories and workspaces. So Vicky, the same Vicky who liked Muhammad Ali earlier, she's worked in this corn processing plant for years, and it was a tough environment in a lot of ways. And it could be a tough environment, especially for the young college-educated engineers who would come to the plant. And when they arrived in the plant, they'd have to be shown how this plant works. And so that meant that you'd have some of the working class technicians that would show the college boys, right, how to actually operate the plant. And the working class guys loved to give the college boys hell, right, when they came into the plant. And so they try to break them down and challenge them in different ways. And Vicky remembered this one young engineer who suffered because he wouldn't stand up for himself. He'd go and work, he'd show up, and this older technician would give him a hard time. And he'd say, "You're a dumb fuck. Say it." Right? Right? And Vicky watched all this in horror because she's thinking to herself, she's thinking, stand up for yourself. Don't be pushed around by this guy. Stand your ground. Right? But he didn't, because the college boy came from a different culture, a different sort of social upbringing. And so instead he gave in. Right? He said, "I'm a dumb fuck." And Vicky couldn't believe it. She thought, look, that's the end of you. You're done. And it was. The guy quit. He had to quit. And he had to quit because his reputation had been too tarnished. It couldn't be restored at that point. And interestingly, Vicky, she didn't like the bullies, but she blamed the college kid, right? It was his fault. You can't show weakness. Going back to Cianci, Parker, Trump, right? You have to stand your ground and not, there's no high road. Right? Now, Now, it's worth noting that, outside of the places we visited, if you think about the first politicians who first gravitated toward Trump, the first Republican politicians who did, they tended to be somewhat cruder, more combative, most notably Rudy Giuliani, Chris Christie, right? Meanwhile, those Republican politicians who least liked Trump, in fact, were never Trumpers, really rejected it, especially Mitt Romney and Jeb Bush. They were among his earliest and fiercest critics. So I think what's arguably most distinctive in some ways about Trump's candidacy is that he violated the social norms of the professional class, right? He violated those norms. And so one's fidelity to those same norms seems to be a pretty good predictor of what one thinks about Trump in many cases. And of course, Trump himself has shown an admiration for strong men, right? Right? I mean, we'll be arguing about the Mueller report probably forever, but I mean, part of Trump's fondness for Vladimir Putin is a similar kind of style, right? Trump likes these strong figures. He holds them in high esteem. That's why he liked generals in his cabinet, right? It's why he seems to show a certain fondness for North Korea's Kim at times, right? So Trump's attraction to these men, I think, reflects, again, this shared culture of honor that prizes strong and dominating men. Now, I suppose one might think, well, look, I mean, I could see why, if you're a populist and you think, Washington's really corrupt in a swamp, you might want just a tough guy, right? Because somebody's got to go in there and clean it up. And so you might like Trump merely for just, you might like Trump's toughness merely for instrumental reasons, right? Like, you don't particularly like the style, but it's sort of what's needed at this moment. I think there's some truth to that in the case of his supporters, but I would also say that they didn't always express, the people we talked to didn't always say, gee, I like Trump's toughness because it's necessary. They liked it in and of itself, right? That is, I think they liked it because of a certain kind of cultural proximity, right? It seemed familiar. It seemed, he seemed like one of their neighbors. And so they felt a real kinship with Trump. And, it's why Vicky, for example, likes Trump and Muhammad Ali, right? It's why Kanye West, I think, likes Trump, even though he doesn't particularly like his policy agenda. In other words, I think Trump appealed to some Democrats because of a common respect for toughness that binds all these various kinds of folks together. And this interpretation is sort of consistent really with what we know about voting behavior generally, right? Usually when people vote, they don't really vote their policy views or even their ideology. They vote a sort of social identity, right? They decide which candidate sort of really reflects them and their community. And so voters often, want to know if a candidate really speaks their language, if they seem familiar, if they seem like somebody they can trust. Right? Of course, citizens also have overlapping social ties, right? And that might create a certain kind of tension at times. So Trump, the candidate, created these identity-based tensions, right? Voters in these Democratic communities said, look, I'm loyal to the Democratic community, but I also really like this kind of working class president and the way he sort of presents himself. And so then they had to choose, right? Do I choose a candidate, do I choose my party, or do I choose a candidate who really speaks my language? Similarly, Kanye West had to defend off, right, accusations of disloyalty to his race, right, by voting for Trump. And so in all these cases, it seems to me, a kind of cultural identity rooted in class vitiated both partisan ties in the case of the working class towns we visited, and racial ties in the case of Kanye West. Those who say Trump's appeal was narrowly race-based, I think oversimplifies identity politics. So I sort of want to say something a little deeper about it, right? Obviously race mattered, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But working class whites, I think, were drawn to Trump partly because he behaved in ways that was familiar to them, right? That in ways that are respected in their communities. Trump is one of them. He's crass. He's brazen. He's tough. He's America's first modern working class president, in lots of ways, despite the fact that he's loaded, right? Right. Okay. So I think if you stress the importance of racial identity, you, I think you miss these deeper class-based identities too, right? Okay, I want to sort of move along because I want to leave a little time for Q&A too. I want to say, let me say a final point about honor culture and then I move on. I think, understandably, many have sort of said, look, Trump's behavior in office is a threat to our political norms. And, I'm happy to talk more about this too. I would just say that our fieldwork suggests that he didn't violate political norms. What he did is he violated national political norms. Because if you look at local political norms, they can be quite different, right? Because he behaved in ways, again, consistent with the way local candidates behave in these communities. And, if that seems odd, I think it's a sign of, I think it's a sign of our cultural divide in lots of ways, right? I mean, most cultures throughout human history have fundamentally been honor cultures, and it's only sort of more recently that some have drifted away to what we call dignity cultures often. But these transitions have happened unevenly, right, across the world and inside the United States. The smash success Hamilton. Have you guys seen Hamilton? A few? Okay, great, right? Hamilton reminds us that our national leaders used to get involved in duels to defend their honor, right? But it also miseducates us too, right? It misleads us insofar as it suggests that honor culture has been extinguished from American politics, right? And it's disappeared. It hasn't, right? We just don't see it because it tends to survive and exist in small communities that are removed from the kinds of communities that most of us live in. Okay, okay, I want to talk about one other difference that struck us, and one that is also connected to social identity. Identity in these places is also really tightly connected to the town itself, right? So individuals really think of themselves as, their identities are really deeply connected to the town they grew up in and live in. And so the citizens we spoke to think of themselves first and foremost as citizens of Johnston, as citizens of Ottumwa, as citizens of Elliott County, right? One is made a full citizen of those places, not merely because you live in it, but because you make contributions to it. You make sacrifices to the town in various ways. And so those who make greater sacrifices to the town are held in higher social esteem than those who make fewer contributions to the town. But it also means that citizens from neighboring counties and communities are also in some ways strangers, right? I mean, they are not fully part of the community, right? They are to some degree outsiders, right? They are outsiders. And so one might say, in fact, that the ethos of these places is Johnston first, Ottumwa first, Elliott County first. And those ethoses, they're evident in everyday life there. And I'll give you a few examples. Locals in Ottumwa, for example, like to buy their products in town, right? So they don't want to buy their car. They get upset, right, when they see neighbors sort of buy their car in some neighboring or adjacent town, even if they can get it cheaper over there, because those local dollars should be spent in town, benefiting the community, right? Not in some neighboring town or community. In Johnston, I love this example. They just built a new basketball court, and it's popular in Johnston because it's the only indoor basketball court that's public, which is a big deal, if you're in New England, because it's hard to play basketball outside for most of the year. And so the courts can get pretty crowded when the weather gets cold, and so you have folks come in from neighboring communities that want to use the courts. But the local officials in Johnston won't, if the courts get really crowded, they'll push those interlopers off, right? So if you're from Cranston or from North Providence, you gotta wait, right? Because the locals from Johnston should get first dibs on those courts, and get this, to enforce it, they check IDs. They do. They check IDs, right? It's like the courts become a border checkpoint, right? It's not a recreation center, right? And so when the citizens, in these towns, when they turn their attention to their home, to their state, or to the nation, their thinking is informed by the way they think about citizenship in their town, right? So just as they think like, look, local jobs should go to local citizens, they also think state jobs should go to folks who are from that state, right? I'll give you one of my favorite examples. I talked to an official from Johnston, and he just started ranting, about, I'm sort of trying to guide the interview and direct it, and he just had to say this, right? And he said, and he started complaining about the governor's tendency to hire people from other states to work in the state bureaucracy in Rhode Island. And he said, look at the governor. She hires all these freaking out-of-staters, right, to run state departments. What's wrong with Rhode Island people? Are we stupid? Bringing people from Missouri, bringing people from Connecticut, people in from New York? What's the matter with Rhode Islanders? We got no smart people around here? I can't do the accent quite well, but that's the gist of it. So, to citizens in Johnston, right, get this, even Americans from, yes, Connecticut are outsiders, right? So, just as citizens prefer to patronize local businesses, they also prefer to buy American-made products, right? And this was also striking. When I was in Ottumwa, one of the things I noticed after a few days is that there were very few Japanese-made sedans, which, having grown up in California was just sort of startling, right? Because, I don't know anybody who doesn't buy a Japanese car, right? Unless it's some high-end luxury German car or something that's what everybody does in Claremont, as far as I could tell. But few folks do this in Ottumwa, right? They want to buy American-made products, and they want to buy American-made cars. Some take this further. I talked to a guy who really looks hard for American-made tennis shoes, right? And coffee makers, right? And the rest. So I think that Ottumwa first, or America First, rather, it embodies a set of positions that were broadly popular long before Trump ever came up with the slogan America First, right? There was already this nationalism, and I think it reflects a particular way of imagining political community, right? One that grows up from the social and political life in these towns, and not downward from abstract notions like whiteness or nation. It's something that grows up sort of organically, right, locally in the town itself. There are local roots to American nationalism, right? I think this localism means that the intense localism also means that if you're from these communities, you have to think about you have to think about immigration differently than we tend to think about it here in Claremont, because if you want to preserve these communities, you have to worry about mass immigration, and that's largely because ethnic diversity undermines often social trust and bonds and civic life in communities. There's a huge social science literature that shows this, right? As communities become more ethnically diverse, there's less neighborliness, there's less social trust. At least in the short and middle term, right? I think long term, that's not necessarily the case, but in the short term, it's certainly true. And I would just sort of emphasize that, I think ethnic and cultural diversity plays out a lot differently in educated professional communities, and the kinds of communities they live in. And because I think this is true because their communities aren't really rooted in neighborhoods, right? Instead, they're much wider. They're centered in workplaces. They're often more virtual. And so mass immigration allows these professional communities to nurture these broad cosmopolitan connections in all kinds of ways, right? It frees them from, in a way, it sort of frees them from their neighborhoods, right? They don't have to do any domestic labor in their house. They can outsource childcare. They can outsource lawn care. immigration allows elites to tend the kinds of communities that they care about, right, by freeing them from their neighborhoods. It's not surprising, therefore, that Trump did especially well during the primaries in racially homogenous communities that had experienced a lot of immigration in recent years. And this was true of both Johnston and Ottumwa, where there was a big increase in the number of immigrants in those communities. And so I think concerns about immigration, I think there's lots of irrational prejudices against immigrants. I'm happy to talk about this. But I also think that concerns about immigration are also embedded in these different identities, right? These civic identities. Identities that I think are narrower in lots of ways than racial identities, right? They really think of themselves as citizens of Ottumwa and Johnston, et cetera. But also potentially broad enough to eventually include newcomers. I'm happy to talk about that as well. Okay, I think I'll shut up because I want to talk to you. Yes, sir.
One morning, you wake up, and you're no longer John Shields, the associate professor of government
Yeah.
at Claremont,
Yeah.
You're Joe Biden, and you've just been nominated by the Democratic Party to be their candidate for president.
I'm glad this is just a thought experiment.
It's hypothetical. What are you going to do? What are you going to say?
Yeah.
How are you going to act?
Yeah.
To get the Trump voters, the Democrats, back in the Democratic Party?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say a couple things. One, I think that I think there's a lot of ways to win a national election, and so I don't know that it's critical, for example, that Democrats get these voters back necessarily, right? I don't know that. I think there's many different roads to the White House. I think there's all kinds of reasons that Trump won. There's a lot. He had a certain amount of fortune in this last election. So I guess I would say that I wouldn't, I mean, it could be that, right, it's enough to increase minority turnout in, right, major cities and some of the swing states, and that's enough, and you can sort of ignore these voters. On the other hand, I think the Democratic Party has to ask themselves, do they want to be the party of, metropolitan centers, right? I mean, I think that's a sort of a kind of a different kind of question, I think, right? What kind of party do they want to be? I think there's lots of ways to win in 2020. I think the bigger question is long term, do they still want to be the party of the white working class? Is that somehow important to them that they are going to be the party of FDR and sustain that kind of support broadly for the white working class? And if you think the answer to that is yes, then I think Joe Biden becomes attractive as a candidate, right? I mean, he's a guy that I think can appeal to those voters. And I think just the fact that Biden is sort of less, I think he's got lots of advantages just over Hillary, right, in a lot of ways. I mean, I think he seems less of the professional class in a lot of ways, right? I mean, he comes from a more working class background. He talks that way. He seems more down to earth. So I think I think he could do well. Now there's some, I mean, I've got a colleague over, at Columbia named Mark Lilla, who's long said, look, if the Democrats want to win, they shouldn't repeat the identity politics that Clinton practiced in 2016, right? Because Clinton went around the country and said, I'm the candidate of, women and minorities and gays and lesbians. And Lilla always says, look, if you go around the country and make a list of the folks you're for, people are going to notice if they're not on the list, right? I think that's good advice, right? I think that's true. On the other hand, right, it seems conceivable to me that one can win an election by playing identity politics too, right? If you got the right turnout in minority communities. So in some ways, I think there's many roads to the White House, and I think Democrats again need to ask themselves what kind of party that they want to be in the future. I don't know. What's your sense, sir? Quickly, I'm sort of curious. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned immigration. I think the Democrats have got to get serious about recognizing that there is a problem.
Yeah.
They've got to come up with some solutions.
Yeah.
also am not real happy with the way that identity politics have been played.
Yeah.
But more generally, in
Yeah.
terms of the toughness,
Yeah.
I mean, does Biden walk up to
No.
Trump and deck the motherfucker?
No. And listen. I think the worst part about Trump is precisely this, right? I get why honor cultures grow and develop in lots of places, but I like the culture of civility, right? And that's something that, I mean, people can have different opinions about Trump's policy views, right? There's all kinds of reasonable views on immigration and tax policy. But I would say, can't act like him, right? Like, you can't call whole nations a shithole, right? Like, you can't call people pigs, right? Like, so I think that there's, I would say there's these deliberative norms that should be defended. And the great danger, I think, of Trump is that we all might acting like him, right? So I would say, no, like, we should not, Biden, nobody, right, should mimic Trump. But I also think that Biden, some candidates can also come across as they don't have to knock anyone out, but they can come off as more sort of down to earth. I mean, I'll give one quick example. For example, Hillary Clinton had a face group book that supported her called Pantsuit Nation, right? And for a lot of the supporters of that group, Facebook Nation was a symbol of feminism. But what people fail to see, it's also a class symbol. I mean, the pantsuit, right? I mean, that is a class symbol par excellence. So I would think about these class-based identities without resorting to the worst aspects of working class culture, which is, again, this sort of fearsome honor culture. I'm overwhelmed. Now, let me, all right, go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
The honor culture concept is a very interesting one because
Yeah.
if you lived and worked in New York City, in Manhattan,
Yes.
in the trades,
Yes.
that's the honor culture.
Yes.
And there's many different
Yeah, that's a good
sectors
point.
inside, but that's where he's from.
Yes.
So it's not surprising that
Yes.
he behaves that way.
Yes, his dad was this way.
I mean, you walk
Yes.
by a construction site in
Yeah.
Manhattan,
Right.
and that's what you get.
Yes, and he had to deal with mobbed up, right, concrete companies and all the rest, right? He had to build in
Truckers.
Vegas, yes, absolutely, right?
Taxi
It's
cab
the world
drivers.
of Rudy Giuliani, Chris Christie, and it's a reminder to me too. I mean, I've been much more interested in Trump supporters than Trump, but I also need to pay more attention to his biography because obviously he comes from an interesting background.
To be successful in the building business
Yeah.
in New York and certainly Manhattan,
Mhm.
that's the way they behave.
That's how you behave.
Whether you agree with it or not, but that's their culture.
Trump is off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's the word.
Yeah. Gentlemen, go ahead. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
have many of the
Yeah.
presidential candidates who run for a second term
Yeah.
are changed by the office of the presidency.
Mhm.
Do you think Trump is going to be authentically the same candidate in 2020 as he was in 2016?
Well, I hate predicting the future, right? Because it's like I'm trying to understand the 2016 election, right? And so social scientists are terrible at predicting the future. So I'll tell you something, and you should just take it with a grain of salt because we're bad at this. But I would say, there was a question when he stepped into office: would he be presidential, right? And that was a real question, right? Because he was stepping in to a distinct social role that had a certain script, right? And we all know that social roles and scripts are powerful, right? So it was kind of a live question at the time, and we quickly learned that no, right? It's still the same Trump. So I think you're going to get more of the same, is my prediction. I'd be surprised if there was any big change in Trump's, certainly in his political style at least, right? I could see him changing policy views and that kind of stuff, but not the way he engages his enemies. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Can you speak about the support of the religious right for Trump?
Yes, I can.
Why
That's a
is
great.
that part of the honor culture?
No, it's a great question.
Expected to be.
It's a wonderful question. So actually, in a lot of these communities, Christianity, in a lot of working class communities, Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity, is in tension with honor culture, right? Because Christianity preaches a culture of civility. It especially wants to soften and domesticate working class men in all kinds of ways. Wants to get them out of the bars, home with their families and their wives. And, so I went to a big mega church in Ottumwa. And it was, you know, I mean, the ministers there do what, I mean, in a lot of ways it was sort of an outpost of middle class values, right, which it often is in these working class communities. And the minister would say things like, would help the parishioners there sort of just like learn like how to resolve conflicts in marriage, right? Like you don't need to just, like when you fight, you don't need to just walk out the door, right? And you can apologize. It's so interesting, right? So I think the culture of honor, sometimes it works in certain workspaces like Wall Street. It's not good in marriages, right? You don't, I mean, it doesn't import well into those relationships. And so I think Christianity is in tension, but it's also the case that these communities are vastly secularized, right? Secularization is happening much faster in white working class communities than in the rest of the country. So the church is also much weaker, right? It doesn't have the same power that it did. And if you look at the primaries, right, Trump was not the candidate of the religious right, right? They liked other candidates. And once he was a candidate, once he, you know, the general election came around, you know, I think for the religious right, it was sort of an easy call because it was Trump or Hillary, and they care about, they care about, you know, the court and the court, Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade, all of that stuff, right? So it's not surprising to me that they voted for him in general, but he was not their guy early on. I'm sorry, I'm going to back. Yeah.
So, you know, again, I think it's interesting what you're talking about in the context of the honor culture and so forth, but I'm a little surprised that you haven't spoken about his appeal to these people in terms of their social and economic fears.
Right, absolutely.
And the way he's addressing those.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's a chapter in the book. It hasn't been written yet. So I was talking about stuff that I feel like I've digested well. But that's absolutely the case, right? I mean, I think Make America Great Again was certainly appealing in these places. I mean, Elliott County is coal country. Ottumwa's been hit hard. You know, so absolutely. I think that's a big part of the story. And I didn't talk about it today, again, partly because that chapter has yet to be written, but also because I wanted just to talk about stuff that might be fresher and more surprising. But I don't want to discount or dismiss that story at all. I think it matters and it's important. Yes, ma'am.
That honor culture really fascinates me.
Yeah.
But I wonder how that, to me, it sounds very much like our new era of toxic masculinity and how they compare.
Yeah.
Because I have a daughter, a 25-year-old daughter, and
Yeah.
has 2 sons, and that's been a big topic for all 3 of them.
Yeah.
About this new era of the white man and how they feel threatened and
Yeah.
the whole idea on the part, you know, sexual assault and all, the Me Too movement, and it sounds very much
Yeah.
counter to this honor culture. And I don't know
Yeah.
if they're related, if they're intertwined, are they connected?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, right? I mean, I guess I would say, generally, in any society, men can always go sideways, right? Like if you look at any culture, you know, I think there's lots of reasons that's true. But I also think that, at least in elite circles, I think men are radically different. I mean, that's not to say that, you know, especially when you get groups of young men together who drink a lot, you get problems. I think that's again true lots of places. But I think that it's, to me it just, you know, I mean, when I take my students, for example, right? I mean, what they call toxic masculinity here is, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, I think they're really shocked and surprised often by what they find in those communities. And I think also, though, that men in those, especially the white working class men, have had a lot of insults to their dignity in various ways. This goes back to the question this gentleman asked earlier. I mean, it used to be that they were providers. And, you know, they didn't do work that was sort of dirty work. They might work in plants. But they had this kind of dignity of being providers, right? And when those jobs went away, and you had the growth of the service sector, it created this, you know, sort of reduced inequality in ways between white working class men and women, because women entered the service sector and did much better in that sector, but it also meant that the men had sort of downward mobility at the same time that white working class women have actually sort of gained a lot economically since the early 70s, while white working class men have gone down. And I think that's just been a huge problem. And so I mean, but I think that's different than what's happening in the sort of more elite circles. But yeah. Do we have time for another?
Maybe
One more?
Maybe you can stay up.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So first of all, John,
Yes.
Great lecture, and it's just wonderful to see CMC's tradition of
Yeah.
fabulous teaching continue. So
Thank you, John.
Two-part question. So first of all, it sounds like most of you are doing qualitative
Yep.
research. It was mostly the in-person interviews. So
Well, in observation too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess I mean
Yeah.
putting a lot of these questions together.
Right.
There are a number of fears, many of them which are socially unacceptable to speak, particularly
Right.
in honor communities.
Right.
I can't provide for my family anymore,
Mhm,
right? They
mhm.
can't say that. That
Yeah.
Trump seems to be
Yep.
playing on.
Yep.
And it's fascinating because there's many different communities with different fears, yet knit
Yeah.
together they become quite the base.
Yeah.
My question is this, I know you're looking mostly at the Trump supporters, but
Yeah.
even through their lens, do you think he is a political mastermind? Do you think he is Machiavellian to an extreme, or did he just stumble into the ability to tug on all these fears?
Yeah. This gentleman here was pushing me on Trump as well. There is a savviness and cunning to Trump. I mean, I think that's true. But I do think he had some good fortune too. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that was. I mean, I don't know. It's sort of an interesting hypothetical question, right? Could he have beaten anyone else besides Hillary Clinton, right? I mean, maybe, right? I don't know. But I will say that, look, the folks in these communities really, this wasn't just a hold your nose election, right? Like, folks in these communities really, really like Trump. A lot of them said, look, I've never been this excited to vote for anyone, right? So, and a lot of them were trying to change their registration during the primary so they could vote for Trump. So you have to come to grips, I think, with that kind of
And
enthusiasm.
they're not educated, but they're hypersensitive to authenticity.
Yes.
And they read him as
Yes.
being true, right?
Yes.
They
Yes.
don't think they're getting played.
No, and there is a certain authentic. I mean, Trump is kind of right. I mean, what you see is what you get, right? Like there's like he's not. He isn't scripted, right? He is authentic in a certain way, right? I mean, he's not, and I think that's very appealing to them.
But is there anybody outside the evangelical community that thinks he actually is for the evangelical community, right? I mean, it's like, it's amazing to me that he's
Well-
able to get that kind of, anyway. so
Well,
it's-
listen. In this era of polarization, I mean, I'm a Republican who voted for Clinton, right? And some of my friends say, well, of course you had to, right? My liberal friends, and I say, come on, right? Like, if what kind of candidate, right? How bad would the candidate on the other side have to be for you to cross the fence, right? Who would that person be, right? And and so I think in this era of polarization, that's hard to do. It's unusual. Right.
Just in defense of Trump.
Yes, sure.
As a pastor.
Yes.
As a pastor.
Yeah.
When he said, pastors can preach politics in the pulpit if they want to.
Yeah.
That was major. If you're a minister, if you're a clergy,
Yeah.
and you're educated, and you want to be a prophetic voice in the community, that was major. So he's done
Yeah.
enough shockingly right things.
Yeah.
That you go, maybe.
But that was an entirely self-serving comment. Right? I mean, it was very politically astute, but it was totally self-serving.
Like, my alpha male is working with your alpha male, but Trump's really an alpha male. Isn't that what your lecture was? That he's an alpha male and we're ready for one, right? Skip these wimpy guys who want an alpha male.
But that's a sort of to a degree, it's a sort of a class-based, sort of style. That's what I would say. And in this era of class divide and growing polarization, it's not surprising to me you get a candidate who appeals to that, who takes advantage of that growing cleavage. Right? In some ways. Why don't we continue? Are we out of time? So,
Yes,
thank you all. Thank you. There's a reception.